become familiar with the idiosyncrasies of this town, the strange customs. You're about to become familiar with another. That is the semi-regular debate about the debt limit. When are we going to hit it? How soon is that debate going to happen?
Well, let me just say we're already having the discussion on it, and I don't think it's a debate. Let me be clear. I think everybody realizes we need to raise the debt ceiling. The government debt is the most important credit in the world, and we're the reserve currency. So this is just a little bit of a process. That's the government process of how we go about. And one of the things I think we should think about over time is changing this process. It should be once we've spent the money that the debt limit goes along with the commitment to spend.
Is it the beginning of September when you think we hit that limit? Is it later in the month? Do you have a specific date at this point?
We constantly review these numbers internally. I don't want to give exact projections. As I've said, I've encouraged Congress to act before they leave for the summer, but we do have enough money to get us through September in case they don't.
Back in January, before you were confirmed, you spoke against prioritization of debt payments. Now that you've been on the job, you're familiar with the office and the way things work here in Washington. Do you still feel that way? Are you against prioritization?
Let me just say, I think that the Congress should raise the debt ceiling so that we don't have to talk about prioritization. That's really the focus. We should be paying our bills when they're due, and we shouldn't put the government at risk.
There hasn't been what I would call a chorus of consensus around this issue and a few others within the administration. There were some of your colleagues who are calling for a clean raise of the debt limit. There are others who think it should be tethered to spending cuts. What's it going to take to get to unanimity on this issue and others within the administration?
Well, I think we have a general understanding within the administration, and we're clear on that, and we're working with Congress. This is really up to Congress to raise the debt limit, and again, it's something I'm confident that they'll do before we get to a point that's critical.
On the issue of unanimity, is the White House saying there is a date by which we will have a tax reform proposal from the White House? Are you speaking with one voice on that issue?
Well, I think we've been pretty consistent in saying we're working every week very closely with the House and the Senate to have a joint plan when we come out. And the idea is to get us all on the same page so when we release the combined plan, it's going to get passed. And it's going to get passed by the House and the Senate, and the President will sign it. And it's our focus to get that done this year. It's critical to the economy, and we're working every day to get that done.
What's your relationship like with lawmakers on Capitol Hill? How have you found that, being new to Washington, being new to this job?
I think we have very good relationships, and I think it's a team effort. I think the good news is we understand what we want to do. We want to get growth in this country. We want to have tax reform. It hasn't been done in 30 years. It's critical. We want to simplify personal taxes. We want to create a middle-income tax cut. And we want to make business taxes competitive. We have one of the highest tax rates in the world with worldwide taxes and deferral, which leads to trillions of dollars left offshore.
You bring up growth. I must say that's the theme of this conference. I talk to maybe a half dozen economists every day, and almost without exception, they disagree with the projections that you have, that we can attain 3 or 4% growth in the near to medium term. What are you seeing that they're not?
Well, again, I just want to put this in perspective. When Obama came into office, he was projecting over 4% economic growth. We obviously haven't had that. We've had one of the lowest growth rates in modern history. And we're just not going to be satisfied with 2% growth. We're going to work every day in this administration to do everything we possibly can to unlock the economic capital, to create jobs, to create better wages, and get growth above 3%. We're committed to doing that.
You're here among and talking to foreign investors. Let me ask you about CFIUS. You've said your decisions on foreign investment are based largely on national security. That's the cornerstone. Would you be in favor of an economics benefits test for investment in the U.S.?
Well, let me just say they're not largely on national security. They're completely on national security. And no, I favor CFIUS to be for national security. There's other things we can do to make sure that we are economically competitive. But the U.S. is one of the freest trading markets in the world. It's one of the freest investment markets in the world. We welcome foreign investors to invest here. And we just want to make sure we get treated the same way abroad. That's really our focus.
You've talked about a strong dollar and a dependable dollar. Not to get into the semantics here, but what's the difference between the two? How do you define a dependable dollar?
Well, again, the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. Again, it's not our focus where the dollar is in the short term. There's obviously certain negative aspects of a strong dollar as it relates to our exports. But on the other hand, a strong dollar is a vote of confidence in the U.S. economy and the Trump administration, similarly to what's going on with the stock market. So this is one of the most important economic investment opportunities, the U.S., and we're seeing a lot of attractions here, and that's a lot about what this conference is today.
On the issue of investment, a few months back you were talking to a colleague of mine out in L.A. at the Mnuchin conference, and you suggested that ultra-long bonds absolutely made sense. Do you still believe that, or are you walking back from that a little bit in light of what T-Back is saying?
I'm not walking back. Again, it's something that we're very seriously considering. I do think it's a tool that the government should strongly consider, and we're reaching out through the borrowing committee and investors to see what the demand is. I mean, what we don't want to do is create a program that's a completely one-off program. We want to see if it would be an important part of our borrowing capabilities.
In the past, people in your position have been advisors to the president on picking future chairs of the Federal Reserve. Has the president solicited your advice on who the next Fed chair should be?
Well, on all the financial regulatory positions, Gary Cohn and I are working very closely together in making recommendations to the president, so that he and I have interviewed all the people and have made joint recommendations to the president.
What do you think constitutes a good Fed chair? In other words, broadly speaking, what do you think the president should be looking for in a Fed chair this next term?
Well, let me just say we haven't made any decisions yet on the Fed chair, whether we're going to have a new one or we're not going to have a new one, and we'll be working closely together with the president as we consider all the issues.
What is your relationship like with Mr. Cohn? We hear so much about the palace intrigue, reports of division or discord within the White House. What's your sense of how the economic team is working, how it's working together?
I think the economic team couldn't be working better together, and that's a combination of myself, Gary Cohn, Wilbur Ross, it's Bob Lighthizer on trade, it's Mick Mulvaney on the budget. We meet constantly, and I think we couldn't be working together. As it relates to Gary and I, he and I have known each other for a very long period of time, and we're worked together very closely in the past.
Otto Warmbier has passed away, of course, the 22-year-old student who was in North Korea for more than a year. The president has passed along his condolences and said that he's reaffirming his opposition to the policies of the North Korean regime. What more can you do? We've seen the Treasury Department deploy and implement sanctions against North Korea. As you react to this news and think about steps forward, are there more tools in the Treasury Department's toolkit when it comes to sanctions?
Well, let me first say it's a very unfortunate situation, and I also pass on my condolences to his family. He was treated very poorly, and nobody should be treated like that. And as we've said before, we are firmly committed at Treasury to use all our powers to put sanctions on North Korea and work with our allies to stop what they're doing. And that's the missile testing, the nuclear testing. This is something we're working very closely with our allies on. I
spoke with your predecessor about sanctions. It was something he was very interested in and worked hard to raise the status of it as a policy tool, implementing sanctions in the realm of national security. Do you see your sanctions policy as an extension of that? Are you doing anything differently than Secretary Lew was doing when it comes to sanctions?
Well, let me just comment. You know, sanctions have been around for a long period of time, and specifically post 9/11, they are a very important tool for policymakers. So we will continue to use sanctions to the maximum amount that we can. And I constantly meet with Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, and at the National Security Council, this is one of the tools we talk about in all of our foreign policy objectives.
I don't know if you've opened your mail from yesterday, but a number of congressmen, Republicans, Democrats wrote you about Rosneft potentially investing or becoming a controlling investor of Citgo, given the status of that company, raising concerns about what that might mean for sanctions, having a company with so much infrastructure in the U.S. under Russian control. Are you concerned about that as well?
Well, first of all, I do read my mail.
Yes.
So I
know it came late yesterday, yeah.
You know, I can't comment on any specific cases in CFIUS, but I can assure them and I can assure others, I take my role as chair of CFIUS very seriously. We will use CFIUS solely for the purposes of protecting our national security, and any transaction that's within our jurisdiction, we will look at very carefully.
Just a last question here about an op-ed that Gary Cohn and H.R. McMaster wrote for the Wall Street Journal on the arena, seeing the world community as less of a community as a place where countries are competing against one another. In that space, what's the role of multilateral institutions?
Oh, I think there's a significant role. I mean, I think there's a lot of common objectives that we have. I think whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the IMF or others, there's definitely a role for us working with our allies, with these institutions to create fixes for problems around the world. I think, as you know, we've been working with the Greeks on the debt crisis there. We're pleased that we've come to an agreement, or the Europeans have come to an agreement, and I worked closely with the IMF and with our partners. Although this is primarily a European issue, we wanted to make sure that this was done, and we're very pleased with the IMF's role in those negotiations.